So in this video, I want to talk about effective note taking. So taking good notes during class can have a big impact on your learning. In bullet point 2 here is a key point. When you're taking notes, I see a lot of students and they're just kind of in class, kind of frantically scribbling, trying to take down everything the instructor says or everything that's talked about in class. And that's probably not an effective way to take notes. Your goal in class shouldn't be to describe everything verbatim, word for word. It should be more to process what's being discussed, process what's being presented, and then try to capture it in your own words, or maybe with your own figures and your own diagrams, right? These are your notes, not trying to capture exactly what your instructor says, right? So that's a key point. The other thing is, remember, your notes are only as good as what you do with them, right? So even if you take great notes in class, if you don't engage with them outside of class, you don't revisit them, you don't review them, you're probably not going to get much out of the time and effort and energy you took into taking notes, right? So I'm going to talk about a specific approach to note taking in this video called the Cornell style or Cornell method. But these are keys, right? You're probably not, your goal shouldn't be to record everything verbatim. And then again, regardless of the style, the structure of notes you take, the important part is probably revisiting them, outside of class in order to make use of them. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of different note-taking methods. Each has their kind of pros and cons. So you could certainly, try out a few different approaches. I'm going to talk about the Cornell method because this is one I've found to be really helpful. I use it for my own, meeting notes and things like that. And I've had students that have really tried this out and really found it to be helpful and effective. And the thing I like about the Cornell style is it helps you organize your notes, but then it also encourages you to engage with your notes outside of class. Right, so it's kind of like it's less of a format. There is a format to it, but it's a little beyond that. It's not just a format, it's almost an approach to note taking that I think will be really effective for your learning. So when you take Cornell style notes, you kind of divide your page into 3 different parts. So this is kind of a depiction of it. You can see on the right side of your notes page, so this would be if you had you were taking notes from paper, you would have 3 sections. You would have a note section, right? And this would make up a big chunk of your paper. So you're kind of dividing your paper into 3 parts. The note section is where you actually write down notes for yourself during class. So again, this is the key point here, that this is where you record information during class. It can be definitions, important facts, you could draw diagrams, examples, whatever you think you're going to need to be able to kind of review at a later point. Again, the key point here is probably not to try to take everything down word for word, right? So this whole section is going to be where you're going to take your notes, right, in class. Now, the other section is kind of this cues column. So this is where typically this is completed after class. So you maybe took your notes during class and then you would go back afterwards, maybe a few hours later or the next day or right after class. Sometimes that's probably the best way to do it is, you took your notes, now take 5-10 minutes after class to just kind of organize them. And that's what you kind of take, that's where that cue column comes into play. So in that cue column, you're just going to write either terms or questions that are going to help to organize your notes. So for example, imagine you were in a class talking about cardiac physiology and your instructor was talking about cardiac output, right? So during class, you would take notes in your notes section, right? You might take, in your own words, you might describe what cardiac output is. You might have different equations. You might have diagrams of how it works. And then when you go back through your notes, in your cues column, you would write cardiac output, right? So the reason you have this cues column is then you can kind of, it makes your notes a little more useful when you go back to review them, right? Because if you want to look through your notes, scan through your notes quickly and say, where is a certain piece of information? In a class that's pretty dense, you may have pages and pages of notes. You can just kind of scan that cue column and say, oh, here's the section where I have notes on cardiac output. Here's the section where I have notes on renal physiology, whatever it may be, right? And then you can go to that corresponding part. The other thing is you can use this cue column when you're studying then, right? Because instead of terms, sometimes you can even write questions here. Like instead of just saying cardiac rehab or cardiac output, you could write what is cardiac output, right? And then all of a sudden, when you're as a form of active recall or retrieval process, you can block out your notes section, go through your cues column, and then answer those questions, attempt to answer them from memory, and then look at your notes, right? So it's a nice way to say, okay, what do I remember? And then go back to your note section, right? So these are the two big parts, right? Is your note section in class, and then your cues column is just kind of helping you organize your notes and create a useful framework for active recall or retrieval practice, right? The last part is at the bottom of the page. So again, you're kind of, if you thought of your notes page, if you had a blank piece of paper, let's imagine you had a blank piece of paper like this. You would basically draw a line here and here, and you would have your notes section in this area, your cues column here, and then the last part is the summary section at the bottom of the page. So the summary section is where you're going to summarize what you learned about a topic or what was discussed after class. And this is kind of the broad big picture summary, right? So it's usually maybe a few sentences, right? A mini paragraph or even just short bullet points like this. So this is where you summarize the bigger picture. So what did we talk about? We talked about the summary. If you talked about, cardiac physiology course, maybe would be the summary, would be in class. We reviewed cardiac output and discussed different factors that can influence cardiac output or something like that. The goal here is to be able to kind of see the bigger picture of what was covered, right? So sometimes when you take notes and you're in a class, right, you kind of get into the weeds. You're talking about all this specific information, but what you want to be able to do is step back a little bit and think about, okay, a bigger picture, what did we actually talk about? What was, if I had to describe it in my own words, if I talked to somebody and they said, hey, what'd you do in class today? This is kind of the summary, right? It's like, oh, we talked about, this topic and this is what that is. And this is, how it fits into the bigger picture of what this course is about. So I think sometimes students will kind of skip over the summary section. And I think that's a missed opportunity because I think, it helps you see the forest, not necessarily get lost in the trees, right? To be able to step back and say, big picture, what did we cover today? So again, that was just a really brief overview of the Cornell note-taking method. Like I said, I've personally found it to be really effective. I use it a lot, and I've had students that have found it to be really effective. One other thing I wanted to touch on, because I get asked about this quite a bit, is writing versus typing your notes. Now, this was kind of an interesting, a little bit of a debate that has come up. So there was a study, and maybe a couple studies that have kind of compared student knowledge retention when they take notes using written notes versus when they take them with their laptop or tablet with typing, right? And they've kind of found that written notes, students that take written notes, tend to perform better, tend to retain more information and things like that. It's kind of an interesting thing. So some people would recur, and I probably am a person that takes a lot of written notes, right? Maybe that's just my age. There's been some other studies that have really shown that it probably doesn't make as big of a difference as you'd think, right? So long story, at least in my opinion, is it probably doesn't matter that much over whether you actually write out your notes with pen and paper or whether you actually type them out on your laptop. The key is probably to not try to take verbatim notes, not try to capture everything word for word. Now, I think typing, the reason why sometimes we take less effective notes when we type is that most people type much faster than they write. Right? So being able to type your notes allows you to use kind of a poor note-taking approach of trying to capture everything that's happening in a session or everything that's said during a session, right? Whereas when you have to write your notes, you could never probably keep up with taking verbatim notes. So it forces you to kind of, summarize, paraphrase, those kinds of things. So that's where I think, writing your notes probably has the advantage over typing. That said, if you prefer to type, that's fine. At least in my opinion, that's fine. Just make sure you're doing those same good things that you would do with a pencil and paper, right? You're paraphrasing, you're drawing diagrams, those kinds of things. You're explaining concepts in your own words. don't get into that habit just because you're a little speedier with your typing that you're getting into that pattern of trying to capture everything that's said. So that's where I put in that last bullet. In my opinion, how you take notes probably is more important than, the medium, whether you type it or write it. The goal should be, again, to paraphrase, summarize, explain things in your own notes, because that's going to require you to process the information that's happening during class, or that's being discussed in class, versus trying to record everything word for word, because you can do that fairly mindlessly, right? You don't have to process information that deeply for it to hear something and then just kind of try to record it, right? So as far as, kind of final thoughts, I think the Cornell note-taking method can be really useful. Try it out, experiment with it, make it your own. I gave you a framework for it, but it doesn't mean that you could say, well, if you prefer to take notes in the notes area and try to fill out the Q column at the same time, I think that can work. If you like to structure your page a little bit different, I think that's totally fine. Whatever approach you use, though, if you use Cornell methods or you decide to use a different approach, again, make sure you're processing information in class, not just trying to record everything that's said. And then the other point is it's also important to engage with your notes outside of class, right? If you take great notes during class, it's not going to help you that much if you don't revisit them and review them and incorporate some of the study strategies like with active recall and those kinds of things later, right? They'll just sit and gather dust over time, and you won't really get much out of your notes if you don't go back to them frequently, right?
If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Learning That Lasts, and check out my book, Learning That Lasts, which is available on Amazon.